Okay, our next step is to take what we learned in the last handout about linear reduction and the relevance of species counterpoint and add into our discussion chord progressions and the kind of Roman numeral analysis and how this relates to the linear aspects. We're going to start to get a little closer to the Schenkerian conception in this video. So we're actually going to be talking about the three basic chord functions, T, P, D, and D, and we're going to be putting those underneath our chords as like a second level of analysis, and how these different chord functions can be prolonged through various linear techniques. So we're talking about basically the three chord functions and the idea of prolongation in this video. The three chord functions, by the way, relate to this thing that's called the phrase model that we'll be talking about in a moment. Now, first off, these basic chord functions. Now, this little bit of information is very broad and is going to be, when we look at the details, it'll be much more nuanced than what's being shown here. But essentially, tonic chords are those chords that have, or at least the chords that have the potential to be a tonic chord, have scale degrees 1 and or 3, usually both of them. Therefore, obviously, the tonic chord, and the other one that usually has tonic function is the 6 chord. And the 3 chord is not used very much, but it would usually have tonic function as well. Dominant chord, of course, that's going to be the 5 chord and the 5/7 chord, but basically any chord with scale degree 7 and 2, so T and Re. And by 7, I'm talking about the leading tone. So in minor, of course, we're raising the leading tone. Therefore, the chords in the dominant category are 5/7, 5 and 5/7, and also 7 diminished and 7 diminished 7. Though, to be honest, when we get into 7 diminished 7, usually that's a prolongation chord. So that one usually won't be given the label dominant in our analysis. Same thing with the inversions of 5/7. Really, when we use the label dominant in our analyses, it's usually going to refer to a root position 5 chord. And also, it's going to relate to the cadence. Now, the last category has the most chords of all, and this will be kind of an intermediary category of predominant. These will be chords with scale degree 4 and 6 usually. The diatonic ones we usually associate with are the 2 chord and the 4 chord. Those are your usual diatonic predominant chords. By the way, notice here I'm just giving the Roman numerals as if they're in a major key, but there will be different qualities in minor keys. But we also have tons of chromatic chords that are predominants. In this category would include secondary dominants of 5. They would just have sharp 4 instead of the natural scale degree 4. The borrowed chords wouldn't change much. The Neapolitan flat 2 would also be in the predominant category. All of the augmented 6 chords, they have scale degree sharp 4 and flat 6, or the minor mode 6. Anyway, so lots of chords with the predominant function are possible, and that's something that's going to kind of build some intensity as you move into the dominant. Next up, let's talk about the phrase model. This comes from a well-known textbook called The Complete Musician by Stephen Lates. And the idea here is that if you're looking at a phrase, the motion tonic, predominant, dominant, and possibly tonic after that, will guide a musical phrase from its beginning to its cadences. Therefore, the cadences will either be a half cadence where it ends on the dominant, or there will be an authentic or full cadence where you end on the tonic. Also know that there are some phrases that omit the predominant stage. That will make for a slightly less exciting phrase, but still, that does happen at times where you just get tonic and dominant. Another thing I'll talk about a little later, and that will come up in some of our musical examples, is if you see, there's something called an embedded phrase model. This will be like a smaller scale tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic progression, but one that does not produce the effect of an ending cadence. Usually these will function as tonic prolongations. If we find a small scale embedded phrase model, we'll usually need more than just 2 levels of analysis, so we can kind of show the layering of things. But one thing that would usually give away the fact that it's not a cadence would be the use of inversions for like especially for the dominant chord. All right, so that's a little bit of background. Now we're going to get into this idea of prolongation, and I'm just going to kind of hit some of the high points that would be very useful for you to know about this particular concept, and I have some musical illustrations of some of the stuff I'm going to talk about on the back page, next page of your handout. So the idea of prolongation basically is just another word for extension. It can also be called embellishing, or compared to embellishing a particular harmony. So therefore, you can prolong a particular harmony in the phrase model, meaning the tonic can be prolonged, the predominant can be prolonged, the dominant can be prolonged. Tonic prolongation is usually the most common of these. So what will often happen is that we'll get a phrase where there's a long period of tonic prolongation at the beginning, and then you'll move on to your cadence with the predominant and dominant. But those other functions can also be prolonged. Now, what makes us hear something, a particular chord, as being a prolongation and therefore embellishing other chords? Well, this is due to the idea of looking at the voice leading and seeing passing or neighboring motions. We'll be talking a lot about this in the bass voice in this video. But if we're kind of thinking about counterpoint, a lot of times you'll see both types of embellishments in the outer voices. And of course, it could also happen in the inner voices, or reductions that will just show the outer voices. So a lot of times we'll be describing certain chords as passing chords or neighboring chords, and this is in relationship to their bass line. And this is where we see the relationship between species counterpoint, or at least one of the places we see a relationship between species counterpoint and prolongation, which is the idea of passing and neighboring motions. We learned about passing, for example, in second species. We didn't cover third species, but if we had, that would have introduced neighboring motions. And so the idea is that we'll see the same things happening with chord progressions. All right, let's get into some details now. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly and show you some voice leading examples of all of these over here. So feel free at any point to pause the video and play some of these examples as we're talking about it. So let's first talk about tonic prolongation. Like I mentioned, this is the most common situation. And so here's where we really see the idea of embellishment at play. One obvious way to prolong the tonic is simply to change position. For example, to go from 1 to 1/6. Basically what's happening here is the bass is leaping and is outlining a consonant interval. Here's your basic template for this, the first example right here, 1 to 1/6. What often occurs in this progression is a voice exchange that I've marked with the lines there. Notice how the bass goes C to E and the soprano goes E to C. This will be an example of the tonic being prolonged just by consonant skip. And I show that prolongation in my second level analysis, which is below, which just shows a T with the line drawn to show the prolongation of that harmony. So this will actually be kind of the basis for some of the ones that are going to come after this. So that will be your consonant skip. Second up, we can talk about passing chords. If we're talking about tonic prolongation, this is usually chords with scale degree 2 in the bass. And situations where the scale degree 2 in the bass passes between scale degrees 1 and 3. And of course, the 1 and 3 would be harmonized by 1 to 1/6, as we just saw there. Let me show you over here an example of this, which summarizes what is mentioned in the handout. This is the second example here. So in this case, I'm going from 1 to 1/6, and I still have the voice exchange, but there's an intervening passing chord in between. Notice how it has scale degree 2 in the bass. So the bass goes do, re, mi, and the soprano goes mi, re, do. So actually both of those chords, the middle chord there, both of the outer voice lines, are passing, right? Below it, I've shown you some of the chords that usually are used for this passing chord. The one I've written is the passing 5/6/4. That's the easiest one to voice lead because you have that common tone. But any of the other 3 chords can also be used. You can also use a 7-6 there. And in that case, you could still do the outer voice exchange. And you can also do 5/4/3, though that one usually wouldn't have the voice exchange because of the extra note you need. And then then 7-6/5 is also a possibility. Basically, these chords all sound very similar. 7 diminished 6/5 is more common in a minor key though, because in a major key you would need a chromatic note to create that. Anyhow, underneath it, once again, I put the T to show that that's basically a big tonic prolongation. So this will be prolongation by passing tone right there. Next up, we can talk about prolongation via neighbor note, and this is usually where scale degree 7 is in the bass. So here we're going to see the tonic being prolonged by a neighbor motion. Neighbor, as you know, starts on a note, goes by step to another note, and then returns to the original note. This third example right here will show you. So this is the second to last example that I'm showing you right now. Notice the bass here goes do, ti, do in C major. So therefore, that's a neighbor motion in the bass. That will give it a sense of being an embellishment of the tonic. You can also use 5/6 there, so lop off the 7th. Or if it's a minor key especially, you could do 7 diminished 7. You can also do 7 diminished 7 in the major key. You just need a chromatic note. Notice the 5/6/5 that I have here produces a neighbor note motion in both the bass, do, ti, do, and the soprano, mi, fa, mi. So that one is an upper neighbor against the lower neighbor. This is the kind of outer voice counterpoint we're talking about. We can now understand how some of these motions we talked about in species counterpoint get played out with actual progressions. Okay, now later on, by the way, I'll ask you to do a little memorization of some of what chords can go here. This will be very useful information. Now, you're noticing so far that these prolongations usually involve the 5/7 chord or the 7 diminished 7 chord, and that's true for most of them. And that's the next one is the situations where we have scale degree 4 in the bass. Usually this is the 5/4/2 chord, and it will create a little neighbor motion into the 1/6 chord. Let me show you over here, my last example. So here I've just gone 1, 5/4/2 to 1/6. And I'm showing it as a tonic prolongation. You can also use 7 diminished 4/3, which would be an equivalent chord there. They sound very similar, just one note's difference. Anyhow, you'll notice how the F neighbor, the F in the bass, neighbors the E. But in this case, it's what we call an incomplete neighbor, in that we leap to it. Kind of like an appoggiatura motion that I've shown you here. But the chord before it could have been a 1/6, and you could have had a straightforward complete neighbor motion. But this will still be called a type of neighbor note. Notice that my soprano line that I use for this one is a passing motion. So again, these neighbor motions and passing motions can be combined to create interesting outer voice counterpoint. By the way, for this bass line, a fa to me, you could also have used a 4 chord. Usually it's one of the 5/7 or the 7 diminished 7, but you could have also used the 4 chord there, because 4 is allowed to go to 1 as a tonic prolongation. So that's another reason to not equate the chord by itself immediately with the function. You might think it's a 4 chord, so it's going to be a predominant, but no, if it goes to 1, then it's a tonic prolongation. Now lastly, I talked about some situations where you have a prolongation of the tonic with scale degree 1 in the bass, basically as like a pedal tone. Okay, so that would be another situation where we can clearly see that a chord is being prolonged if the bass just kind of stays there as a pedal. And there are kind of 2 varieties that I'm showing you over here that I mentioned in the handout. The first one is what we call the neighbor or pedal 6/4. It's the 4/6/4 chord basically, functioning as a tonic prolongation. So in that case, it's called a pedal 6/4 because the bass just acts as a pedal on C. So it just sits there on the same note. It's also sometimes called the neighbor 6/4 because the upper 2 voices, as you can see in my voice leading, move up by step and right back down, creating a neighbor motion. This last one's kind of interesting. Another kind of idea. This kind of combines the pedal idea with the neighbor note idea. If I just look at my bass line here, it goes do, do, ti, do, and you can kind of understand the ti, do as a neighbor note motion. But the chord harmonizing the second do is 2/4/2, and then it goes to 5/6/5 to 1. This is an example of an embedded phrase model, because if we get the chord progression 1, 2, 5, 1, which would be tonic, predominant, dominant tonic, But here it's not producing a cadence, it's producing a tonic prolongation. And this is where we might need more than 2 levels of analysis. We have the Roman numerals, then we have the embedded phrase model, and then underneath it we're showing that it's basically just a big tonic prolongation. So the bass goes do, do, ti, do. It's kind of combining the pedal and the neighbor note. The soprano goes do, re, re, do. So that's a neighbor note motion. Again, these can be combined. So you might want to play through some of these. All right, that kind of hits some of the high points of tonic prolongation. There won't be as much to say about dominant and predominant prolongation, though we'll see some examples of it in music. Kind of depends on the situation. So dominant prolongation, well, the first 2 things I mentioned here are familiar from what we just talked about. If the ordinary 5/7 chord can be a prolongation of the tonic, then secondary dominants of 5 can do the same thing for dominant. So if I do all those same patterns at the level of the dominant, that could be creating a dominant prolongation. And then also pedal point. It makes sense. We know that in tonal music, a lot of times composers will land on scale 5 in the bass as a big pedal, and that will be an obvious case of a dominant prolongation. The chords above it can change, but really it's just like a big 5 chord. The most important one I want to mention here, that hopefully most of you have heard of by now, is the cadential 6/4. This is the most common situation where you find a prolonged dominant, because the D in our phrase model is going to happen at the cadence. So we would expect it to be something involving a cadence where the D might get prolonged. Basically, the cadential 6/4, the arrival on the full root position 5 chord is delayed by stating a 6th and the 4th above the bass. And then these notes, the 6th and 4th above the bass, fall down to the 5th and 3rd above the bass. Let me show you an example here. So right here, you'll notice I also wrote the predominant chord just for demonstration. A lot of times when we get to the cadential 5 chord, you'll see that scale 5 is available for 2 chords in the bass. That's a good giveaway that the composer is probably using a cadential 6/4. So instead of arriving on that downbeat on G, B, D, I have G there like I would expect, but above it I get the 6th and the 4th above G. C is the 6th, C is the 4th, E is the 6th. And then they just drop down. This is the Roman numeral we're going to use in this class, 5/6/4 to 5/3. Basically, 5/5/3 is a root position 5 chord, right? 5/3 is just the root position. 6/4 in this case is treating the notes like non-chord tones, not like an inversion. We're not thinking of it as an inversion here. We're just thinking of the 6th and the 4th as non-chord tones. So you got to be careful with this label. Some folks will incorrectly interpret it as a 5 chord and second inversion, but that's not what it is. That will be completely different notes. It's actually a root position 5 chord with a couple of non-chord tones that resolve down. Okay, so that's the one to really know for dominant prolongation. Now, predominant prolongation is kind of a different business. Remember how I mentioned that there's a whole bunch of chords that can be predominants? Well, you can use these predominant chords in succession and organize them so that they become stronger over time. For example, I'll show you a couple over here. Here are just some bass motions in C major where you have some kind of logical lines in the bass that would work. One option at the beginning here is 4 going to 2. 2 is considered to be a stronger predominant than 4, given the root motion that will happen. So you can put the 4 before the 2 and keep the predominant function happening. In my second example here, I'm using 5/6/5 of 5 as to create a passing motion, kind of chromatic passing motion in the bass between the predominant and the dominant. So I land on 4, that's where the predominant starts. Then I intensify the predominant by moving that to Fi in the bass. So Fa, Fi, Sol. And 5/6/5 of 5 there is still part of the predominant because the root position 5 is where we get the dominant function. The predominant, remember, it has scale degrees 4 and 6. And so that's going to create a predominant prolongation. And then also a lot of times this last one here, augmented to 6 chords, are used a lot, particularly in descending bass lines, like you might have 4/6 starting the predominant and the German 6 following it. These will all be situations of multiple predominant chords in a row, and just organizing them in some logical way. Like you wouldn't go to like the 5/6/5 of 5 and then go back to a diatonic predominant, right? That would create a weakening of the effect. But it makes sense that you can kind of go from diatonic to chromatic in a logical pattern. And then other than that, you're also possible with predominant prolongation to use things like the passing 6/4 chord, a passing 1/6/4. That can also be used to prolong the predominant. Okay, so again, that does not summarize every possibility you could possibly have in tonal music, but it does hit, I would say, some of the really high points and the most common ones. So now that we know this, let me show you on the next page, and this will be the ending of this first video, a little bit of a summary about what we just talked about. This is where I think a little bit of memorization could come in handy. Notice that I'm in the bass clef here, and I'm just writing down a bass line. And what you want to think about here is the bass scale degree and the way the bass moves. And this summarizes some stepwise motions in the bass. Does the bass move up or down, and so on. We start here with the notes of the tonic triad, 1, 3, and 5. Notice how those harmonizations are very predictable. If scale degree 1 is in the bass, it's usually a root position 1, unless it was that weird case of the 2-4-2. But still, if we're talking about most situations, scale degree 1 in the bass is almost always going to be the root position 1. Scale degree 3 in the bass is almost always going to be a 1/6 chord. That's very useful to know. Doesn't mean there aren't some exceptions to this. And then scale degree 5 in the bass, the G. I've shown these notes with open note heads to make them just show you how important they are kind of functionally. Scale degree 5 in the bass is almost always either a root position 5 or 5/7 or that cadential 6/4. And that's kind of your pillars right there of the tonic and dominant for a phrase. Then if we zoom in a little bit to this beginning bit here that I've bracketed and called tonic prolongation, this summarizes what we just talked about. In the bass, T to Do, so the B to C, will be harmonized by one of the 3 chords that I've written down here. So you'll want to memorize that. It'll speed you up a lot in both your Roman numeral analysis and also your part writing. And then if the bass has scale degree 2 and it acts as a passing tone, so notice my arrows are going between 1 and 3, it will be one of these 4 chords that we talked about earlier. Either the passing 6/4 or 5/4/3 or 7/6 or 7/6/5. Those are all those chords, if you compare them with each other, they only differ by 1 note, so they sound very similar. Now again, that's all stuff that we would consider to be tonic prolongation. Then the last thing in the tonic prolongation category is the Fa to Mi bass line, which is usually 5/4/2 to 1/6, and then more rarely 7/4/3 to 1/6. So that's if Fa goes to Mi in the bass. That would usually be a tonic prolongation. However, if Fa, let's move over here, goes to Sol, that is an indication of predominant going to dominant. So Fa to Sol is one of your major bass lines to always be on the lookout for, because you know it's usually going to be a predominant going to the dominant. And in that case, the chord would not be 5/4/2. It would be either 4 or 2/6 or 2/6/5. Again, those chords are very similar in their sound. So right here, like here to here, this is like stuff that you really want to have this memorized. The stuff going up from T all the way up to Sol. The rest of this stuff is a little bit more secondary. If the bass is on Sol and goes to La or Le in a minor key, that's usually what we call the deceptive progression, and there the 6th chord would be acting as a tonic substitute. Whereas if the reverse happens, La to Sol at the ending, or Le to Sol in a minor key, that's usually 4/6 going to 5. I should have written the 5 over there at the ending. So that would be more of a predominant to dominant motion in that case. So in sum, I would highly recommend that you look through this and memorize some of the information. And therefore, when you start to do when we look at the next video and I have you do some Roman numeral analysis, A lot of times what you'll want to look at first is just scan through the baseline and get a good idea of what you think the chords might be. It'll speed you up a great deal and also already give you a good idea about how the phrase model is working, like where the tonic prolongation is, where the dominant arrives in the phrase model, and then where the predominance might be. Okay.